Gun stores don't want you to buy these 3 rifles. Not because they are bad, but because they are so cheap, accurate, and ready to shoot, the store can't sell you any upgrades. Here are 3 budget rifles that smart buyers absolutely love. Number 3. The Mossberg Patriot. Start with the number that explains this entire list. In firearms retail, a new gun usually carries a margin somewhere in the range of 12 to 20%. Accessories run closer to 30 or 40. So the rifle is not really the sale. The rifle is what gets you standing in front of the glass case where the optics live. And that case is where a shop actually pays its rent. Now look at what the Mossberg Patriot does to that plan. It walks in already wearing a scope. Mossberg has been building guns longer than almost anybody still standing. Oscar Frederick Mossberg opened the doors in New Haven, Connecticut in March of 1919, and the company is still the oldest family-owned firearms manufacturer in America. No leveraged buyout, no bankruptcy auction, no brand name floating around inside a holding company. By the late 80s, the majority of production had already moved south to a subsidiary plant in Eagle Pass, Texas, and in 2014, Mossberg poured another 116,000 square feet into that Texas factory. The Patriot itself landed on the SHOT Show floor in January of 2015, and the way it came about is unusual. It did not start with an engineer pitching a concept upstairs. It did not start with a marketing study. Mossberg's own people have said the rifle came from customers walking up at trade shows and asking for something plain, a traditional bolt-action deer rifle, wood stock, blued barrel, the kind of thing their fathers carried into the woods. So Mossberg built exactly that, and then quietly engineered the cost out of it. Considers how strange that was in 2015. The rest of the industry was sprinting toward tactical styling. Black polymer, chassis systems, rails on everything, magazines borrowed from the AR world. Mossberg walked onto the SHOT Show floor with a rifle that looks like it fell out of a 1962 sporting goods catalog, and the market bought it in volume. Over 60 variations shipped, chambered in everything from the little .22 250 up to the .375 Ruger, which was the widest spread of cartridges Mossberg had ever offered in a single rifle family. The line eventually branched into Predator models for varmint hunters, the scoped night train packages, and the Revere, with European walnut, rosewood accents, and a hand-rubbed oil finish. For people who wanted the old look done properly, the receiver is a round-bodied piece of machined steel running a conventional twin-lug push-feed bolt, with a recessed bolt face housing a plunger ejector. The barrel attaches with a barrel nut tightened by a hook spanner, which is why the Patriot's nut carries none of the tooling indents you see on rival rifles. Reviewers called that a cosmetic quirk. It is actually the fingerprint of a specific assembly method. Look at the underside of the rifle and you find the clever part. The magazine well is a single polymer block, and that block doubles as the bedding platform. The receiver sits on pad extensions front and rear. The action screws run down through those pads, and the barrel floats completely free of the stock. One molded component is doing a job that used to require pillars, epoxy, and a gunsmith's afternoon. Then there is the trigger. Mossberg calls it the LBA, short for lightning bolt action, and the blade is skeletonized into a small lightning bolt shape. It adjusts from roughly 2 pounds up to 7, which is a wider window than most rifles offer at any price. Add a spiral fluted bolt, a free-floated button rifled barrel, a recessed crown, and factory scope bases, and the spec sheet starts looking suspiciously like something from the shelf above it. But the part that makes a retailer wince is the packaging. Mossberg sells the Patriot in combination packages with the glass already mounted. Depending on the configuration, you are looking at somewhere between $430 and $630 for a complete, scoped, ready-to-zero hunting rifle. Mossberg noted early on that the walnut versions and the scoped combinations were outselling everything else in the line, think about what that does at the counter. A customer buying a Bear rifle is a 4-step sale. Rifle, then optic, then rings, then a mounting fee. A customer buying a Patriot combination is a 1-step sale, and the 30 to 40% margin that was supposed to come out of the optics case never happens at all. Is the included glass the best you will ever look through? Not close. On the cheaper packages it is entry level, and a serious shooter will eventually replace it. The stock has flex in it. The 2-position safety is basic. The spanner tightened barrel nut is not the prettiest piece of work in the rack. But for a hunter who fires 2 boxes of ammunition a year and needs 1 clean shot at a whitetail in November, the Patriot answers the whole question out of the box for less than the price of a decent scope on its own. That is the entry-level version of this argument. The next rifle has been making the same argument for 60 years, and it has sold more than 7 million copies doing it. Number 2. The Ruger 1022. In 1964, Bill Ruger wanted a rimfire that looked like the .44 Magnum Carbine his company was already selling. What he and engineer Harry Seyfried II actually produced was a rifle still in continuous production 6 decades later. With an aftermarket so enormous you can now assemble a complete one without a single Ruger-made part inside it. There is a prototype in the Ruger archives, serial number X1, and it is worth knowing about because it shows how close the design came out of the gate. Look at it quickly and it passes for an ordinary 1022. Look closer and the differences are small and telling. It wears the front sight from the .44 Magnum Carbine, complete with an ivory insert, where the production gun got a simple brass bead. The receiver has no provision at all for mounting a scope, and there is no bolt lock. Almost everything else was already right on the first try. The shape was no accident either. The 1022 carries the profile of the M1 carbine, the little rifle a very large number of American men had carried personally less than 20 years earlier. Bill Ruger understood exactly what he was doing there. Familiarity sells. Start with the magazine. Because that is the piece everybody recognizes, Bill Ruger admired the Savage 99, a lever gun that fed from a rotary spool instead of a stack. He carried that idea into rimfire. The 1022 magazine holds 10 rounds in a small cogwheel rather than a column, which lets it sit perfectly flush with the bottom of the stock. Nothing hangs down. Nothing catches on a fence wire when you are climbing over it. And because every cartridge sits in its own pocket, the soft lead noses of rimfire ammunition are never pressed against the primer of the round beneath them. Then comes Seyfried's quiet stroke of genius, and you only notice it if you have shot a lot of cheap semi-automatic rimfires. Blowback 22s cycle fast, too fast, and the bolt returns to battery before the magazine has finished rotating the next round into position, and you get a stoppage. The standard fix is to add something. A buffer, a heavier spring, another part. Seyfried added nothing at all. He built a slight cam action into the bolt itself, so the rearward motion is arrested by the geometry of components that were already there. When Guns and Ammo tested 13 rimfire rifles in 1964, the Ruger clocked 945 rounds per minute, the second slowest gun in the entire test. The Remington Nylon 66 ran at 1560. The Mossberg 351C hit 1600, slowest usually reads as a criticism. Here it was the entire objective. A slower cycle gave that rotary magazine time to work, and the result was a rifle that would feed almost anything you put in it. The third piece is the barrel attachment, and this is where the cost engineering really shows. On most rimfires, the barrel is pressed into the receiver and pinned in place. On expensive rimfires, it is threaded, which means cutting matched threads on the barrel shank and inside the receiver, and that is slow, careful, costly machining. Ruger did neither. The 1022 uses a V-shaped steel block that seats against a beveled surface on the barrel and draws it back into the aluminum receiver, held by 2 hex screws. No threads to cut, no hand fitting. 2 screws and it locks up solid. That single decision saved Ruger money on every rifle it ever built. It also, more or less by accident, created the largest firearms aftermarket in America outside the AR platform, because a barrel retained by 2 screws is a barrel anybody can design a replacement for. All of this sits inside Bill Ruger's larger manufacturing philosophy. He built the company around investment casting, the lost wax process that dates back thousands of years, and stood up his own foundry, Pine Tree Castings, in 1963. Instead of adapting forged designs to casting, he designed guns from the ground up around what casting genuinely does well. That is why older Rugers carry that slightly heavy, chunky look. The parts are shaped by the process that makes them. The foundry eventually got so good that it spent decades casting components for industries with nothing to do with firearms. A 10-22 sold for $54.50 in 1965. A standard carbine today runs somewhere in the 300s, so why would a shop rather sell you something else? 2 reasons, and only one of them is obvious. The first is arithmetic. On a $300 rifle, a 12 to 20% margin works out to somewhere between $36 and $60, before you count the staff time spent on the paperwork. The second reason is slower and stings more. A 10-22 does not wear out. It gets handed down, and every dollar that owner eventually spends on a new stock, a heavy barrel, a better trigger group, or a red dot goes to a third-party company, usually ordered from a screen at midnight. And none of it ever comes back through the shop that made $40 on the rifle in the first place. Nobody is being greedy here. That is simply what happens when a company builds something that outlives the transaction. Now, the rifle at number 1 does something the other 2 do not. It does not just skip the upsell. It makes the upsell genuinely hard to justify. Number 1. The Savage Axis II. To understand why a $400 Savage causes a problem, you have to go back to 1958 and an engineer named Nicholas Brewer. Brewer had spent the post-war years absorbing a lesson the entire American industry was learning at the same time. Wartime production had proved that guns could be built faster and far cheaper than 19th century methods allowed, and there was enormous domestic demand waiting for whoever figured it out first. Brewer had already applied that thinking to the inexpensive Stevens 325, which grew into the Savage 340. Then he took everything he had learned and designed a full centerfire hunting rifle around it. They called it the Model 110. It sold for $109.95, and that is literally where the model number came from. Round the price up, and you have your 110. Now the trick that mattered, because it is still inside the rifle you can buy this afternoon. On a conventional bolt action, headspace, meaning the precise relationship between the bolt face and the chamber, gets set by machining barrel and receiver to match each other. Get it wrong and you either cannot close the bolt or you have a dangerous gap. Getting it right takes skilled hands on every single rifle that leaves the building. Brewer sidestepped the entire problem. The barrel threads into a cylindrical receiver and a nut threads onto the barrel behind it. During assembly, a gauge goes into the chamber. The barrel turns in until the bolt closes on that gauge, and then the nut is torqued down to lock everything exactly where it sits. Correct headspace on every rifle, without a master gunsmith touching any of them. Brewer paired that with a floating bolt head, a 2-piece bolt whose head can shift slightly to bring both locking lugs into even contact with the receiver. Bill Ruger built his rifles around a foundry. Brewer built his around a nut and a gauge. 2 men attacking the same cost problem from opposite ends. There was one more thing that cylindrical receiver made cheap, and it changed who could buy a rifle at all. Because the action was a simple round bar of steel rather than a complex forging, Savage could mirror the whole design without retooling half the factory. In 1959, the company became the first major American manufacturer to produce left-handed bolt-action rifles in real volume. Left-handed shooters had been buying right-handed guns and living with it for a century. Brewer's cost engineering ended that, almost as a side effect. The 110 is now the longest continuously produced bolt-action rifle in America. Brewer never saw the patent issued. It was granted in 1963 after his death, which brings us to 2010 and a very specific moment in American economics. The housing market had collapsed 2 years earlier. Hunters who used to buy a $900 rifle simply were not buying one. Savage had already been probing that end of the market with the Stevens Model 200, a stripped-down 110 with a gray synthetic stock and an internal magazine built from 2005 to 2013. The Model 200 proved the appetite existed. The Axis was the answer built deliberately for it. Savage launched it as the Edge at a suggested retail price of $329, with dealers frequently moving it under $300. A year later, apparently over a naming dispute, the Edge quietly became the Axis. Same rifle, new badge, slightly higher price, which annoyed a lot of dealers who had just finished ordering the cheaper one. Then the Axis 2 added the component that changed the conversation. The AccuTrigger. There is a small lever set into the middle of the trigger blade called the AccuRelease. Until your finger fully presses that lever, it physically blocks the sear and the rifle cannot fire. That one part lets Savage ship a trigger that breaks light and clean and is adjustable by the owner, with no gunsmith involved, on a rifle costing less than a custom trigger job alone would have cost 20 years earlier. The idea worked well enough that several other manufacturers went and built their own versions of it, stacker the thread in head spacing, the floating bolt head, and a button-rifled barrel on top of that. And the current Axis 2 sits between $400 and $500 depending on configuration, with combination packages arriving with a bore-sighted Bushnell already mounted and ready, and it shoots. That is the uncomfortable part. I want to be honest about what that means and what it does not. It does not make the Axis a better rifle than something costing 3 times more. The stock flexes. The polymer magazine can be fussy about seating properly. In a heavy chambering, that light stock will beat you up over a long day. The bolt lift is noticeably stiffer than a Ruger American, and the throw is longer and clumsier under a scope. What it means is narrower than that, and more damaging. For the one specific job of putting a bullet exactly where you aimed it at 200 yards, the $400 rifle and the $1,200 rifle punch the same hole in the paper. That is the conversation nobody wants to have across a glass counter. Not because anyone behind it is dishonest, but because this one is nicer is a far harder sentence to sell than this one shoots better. And with an Axis 2 sitting 3 feet away in the same rack, the second sentence is no longer available to you.